Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Navigating Social Identity in the Workplace panel hosted by Equal Justice Works. My name is Lynn B. Toombs, and I am the Director for Alumni Relations at Equal Justice Works. I am pleased to introduce to you 2017 fellow alum Eric Provitt, who will serve as our moderator for today and facilitate the introduction of our panelists. During his fellowship, Eric sought to preserve affordable housing on Atlanta's west side by preventing displacement and improving substandard living conditions. He hopes to represent low-income tenants in Atlanta's Vine City, English Avenue, Ashview Heights, and Atlanta University Center neighborhoods who face unlawful evictions and have unresolved conditions and repair issues. After completing his fellowship, Eric became a senior consultant with the Financial Crimes Unit at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Eric is currently the Identity and Fraud Solutions Specialist at Equifax in Atlanta, Georgia. We are so excited to have Eric and all of his enthusiasm, along with all of our panelists here today. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Eric.
Thank you so much. It's always weird hearing about yourself in the third person, but I appreciate the warm introduction. And again, welcome everyone to our time. We're looking forward to an active and engaging hour with two dynamic panelists. The format or the overview of how the panel is going to work, we're going to give the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. We'll spend about 40 or so minutes in a sort of question and answer format. We have some ideas or some thoughts about the navigating social identity, and we want to bring that to you. There'll be about 15 minutes at the end for question and answer. And so if you all have access to the chat box, if you would just pop some questions in there, and when we get to the question and answer portion, we'll take some of those questions and we'll try to get you some answers. If not, and we are unable to get to your question in the time we have, we'll take some time to try to get those answers out to you in sort of an email format. We are going to give the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. They'll take 3 or 4 minutes to do that, and then we'll dive sort of right into the question and answer format. So first, we have Fairuz Abdullah. She is the Director of Employer Relations with the University of California, Hastings Law.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Lindia and Eric, for having me join today. So I'm the Director of Employer Relations at UC Hastings, and I work with employers to create opportunities for our alumni and our students. It's a really exciting job where my extrovert energy gets to go out and talk to people, so I love that. Although now I'm doing it more virtually. Previously, I was the Director of Public Interest and Public Service, and I work with students to help them find their public interest and public service careers. I work with a lot of students who are applying for fellowships, especially EJW, so I have a special affinity for this organization. And before that, in my previous life as a lawyer, I was a juvenile dependency and family law attorney, and I worked a great deal with low-income to modest means clients. And in my personal life, as well as my other life, I'm an executive coach. I have my own coaching practice where I work with, and I use my coaching to work with students, to work with other clients, to work with lawyers on a variety of areas. One of them is building soft skills, tackling imposter syndrome, and building strategies on how to sort of identify and respond to incidents of bias in the workplace. So those are some of the, in a nutshell, what I'm sharing with you guys today for this presentation. Archana?
Thanks, Fairuz. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Lindia. Thank you to the Equal Justice Works. My name is Archana Sagal. I currently, actually as of a month ago, I started a new project called Project Hyphen, which is building public-private partnerships between the Biden administration and private philanthropy. My background involves both the federal government and private philanthropy. Previous to starting Hyphen, I ran the C4 organization at the National Immigration Law Center. And before that, I worked for a handful of national foundations, global foundations, including the Open Society Foundations, the Buffett's Nova Foundation, and before the 2016 election, which is when I moved to Los Angeles, I was working at the White House as a political appointee, and I was also at the Department of Commerce. So a combination of politics, advocacy, and philanthropy is my background, and I'm based in LA.
That's great. Thank you both. I think it's going to make for a dynamic and entertaining discussion based on the topic and the background that you all have. So, a lot of our alumni are currently nonprofit owners, law school professionals, public interest attorneys, and government employees. And where our fellows are in their sort of matriculation through this process is, there's a lot of engagement with funders and directors and learning how to balance the advocacy with the sort of process of working in the business world. So this is going to make for an entertaining discussion and informative as well. So the sort of backdrop to the conversation that we're going to have, if I could paint a picture, in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, thousands of corporations and nonprofits have released statements and made commitments to sort of advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in their organization. We also saw more companies aligning themselves to social justice efforts and anti-racism causes and organizations. Fairuz, tell us from a corporate culture and sort of fundraising, what does it look like with the backdrop of everything that's going on with George Floyd, everything that's going on in our world and in our culture? Now, how has that changed? Has it changed? And talk to us a little bit about that.
Okay, so I think this question was designed to talk about what's happening in corporate culture. And it's really interesting because what's happening when it comes to corporate culture is there used to be a corporate responsibility officer that kind of handled all the social justice giving or nonprofit giving that was sort of happening in the corporate culture. But now there's like a movement of change that's happening. And it's morphed into a corporate social justice movement. And a lot of that is in response to socially aware customers, as well as socially aware employees who are putting pressure on companies to act and make a change and donate to social justice organizations, be committed to changing internal policies, how they are, how they show up in the world politically, like making statements, coming out against certain things. All of this is kind of driven right now by employees and customers, which is really kind of interesting. Also, there's this movement of employee crowdsourcing going on with donations on social media. And also matching campaigns. So I think there was an Adobe engineer recently who started, pushed to have a donor matching campaign in the company. And what he did is he just put it on social media, asked friends and family to donate, and he was able to come up with a really large sum. I think it was like something like $7,000, and Adobe matched that. So that's another thing that's sort of going on. And so employees are really driving change on the inside. And a lot of this also has to do with trust between employees, shareholders, customers, and the community that they want to impact. So a lot of these conversations are sort of happening. Maybe there's going to be some people who are not happy about some of these changes. Some people are happy about this, but there's kind of three ways that it works. One is the workforce vision, right? People who are working within the organization sort of have this vision for wanting to make change. Then sometimes it's driven by leadership. Maybe it's leadership that wants to make the change. And then it's also the organizational value system. Like, what are the organization's values? Or people are having more discussions about that. Like, what are the corporate values to kind of push that as well? So there's a lot of really interesting things going on in that space.
No, that's great. That made a lot of sense. So many of our alumni and our fellow they work on the nonprofit side of the for-profit pendulum. My mother used to tell me growing up, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but she'd also say that you have to take the bitter with the sweet. And so that balance, I think, is important. Let's say an organization wants to give you money. You need their money, but you're not quite sure you like what the sort of funder, what they stand for, what their history has been, but you decided to take that money. How do you navigate that process? What does that do from a sort of authentic conversation standpoint?
I mean, it's a great question. And I think that's the key, is the authentic conversations that you want to bring to the forefront. And a lot of that has to do with getting a gut check for yourself too, and adjusting your own mindset, right? So you're basically, the mindset would be, okay, what if I took a chance? What if the funder actually had good intentions? This corporation that I'm kind of like, I'm not so sure about you, but what if you had good intentions, or the people who've approached me are having good intentions? And the next part is, what if they do want to support social change or change the narrative of giving? And the conversation with them gets to start something positive. So I think that's the first piece, is having that mindset. Because sometimes when we're not comfortable, right, with an opportunity or a conversation, or we're not feeling good about it, that carries through in how we show up, right? How do we show up for this conversation? How do we engage with people in that conversation, right? So the first thing is always to check your mindset. Even if you're distrustful or not quite sure, do your homework. And I think that's super important. You want to have as much data on your side as possible when you talk to this possible, corporate donor that's coming forth. So you want to have that homework done, but then you also want to bring that open side of yourself. And when you do that, a lot of times people also bring that open side of themselves, right, to have that conversation, because you're always going to have champions on the other side, right? And think about the average worker, or maybe there's a leader, or maybe there's shareholders that are pushing. So you're not going to have every piece of the pie is not going to be the same. Everyone's going to have a little bit of a difference, but hopefully they're coming together and they're saying, hey, we want to donate to your cause or your organization. So that's the first thing. And then you want to also map out your conversation goals, right? Like, what are your goals? What do you actually want to walk away with? Do you want to walk away with this and say, okay, this might be a conversation that I want to have with a potential future opportunity, or maybe this is an engagement for something I need now, or maybe this is a conversation that I have so I can connect this potential donor to someone else. So really having a good sense of what your goals are for this conversation and what your asks are. The next thing is really thinking about alignment of the mission, right? Are they coming to you? Are you the right person that they want to come to with their donations? Are they clear about what you do? So that's really clear. That's really important too, right? So you want to make sure that they have an understanding of what you're offering or what you're going to do. So you want to have your elevator pitch lined up, right? Like, well, how is it you're going to present yourself? So that's really important. The other thing is like philanthropic values. Are their values aligned with yours? And this is an important conversation that everyone should have all the time. Like, you not only want to check in with what your personal values are, but what are the values of my organization? What are the values of you, corporate donor, that you're coming to meet with? Like, what, and are these things aligned? Because I think when you're not aligned with people, that's definitely where conflict arises. Yeah. And you also want to have like a collaborative mindset rather than a combative mindset, right? I mean, you think about a situation where maybe your parents got divorced, one of your parents is dating a new person, you're going to this conversation, you're going to go meet the new person that they're dating, and you really don't want to. They're going to pick up on that energy. So you always want to think about that collaborative mindset. So that's definitely where I would say the starting point is.
Yeah, that second to last comment, we could probably almost spend an hour talking on that all by itself. That was really, really good information and really good feedback. Archana, what are your thoughts on that? How do we deal with companies that have no history of working with social justice organizations? What does that look like?
Okay, great questions that I've been thinking a lot about. So I've spent a little bit of background. So I've spent a lot of time giving money away as a grant maker, and I've spent a lot of time raising money. And so I've been on both sides of the coin. And one of the things that's really I wouldn't say exciting, but one of the things that there's an opening because against the backdrop of all of the injustice and violence, the state sanctioned violence, is that finally, racial justice and racial equity is being heralded as something to pay attention to. It's a framework that we are needed. And so there is the opening around racial equity. And you see it both in philanthropy as a deep desire to really understand how racial equity is threaded through foundations' grant-making portfolios. And you're actually seeing it in the administration, knowing that, you know, President Biden named racial justice and equity as one of his top 4 priorities. And so because of that opening, there is a chance to be able to really talk about racial, social, economic justice, gender justice. And I am really heartened by it. You know, it's been a really, really intense week, month, years, decades, life around racial equity as a person of color and as a woman of color in this country. And I really am a glass is half full open in terms of like, this is an opportunity to really move a radical vision for this country forward. But as it relates to resources, there's this old fundraising adage that makes me laugh every single time I hear it, which I will share with you, which is, the problem with tainted money is that they're taint enough. And it makes me laugh.
Say that again?
The problem with tainted money is that they're taint enough.
Okay.
Like
okay.
That there ain't enough. And so the idea is behind all money is green. So the reality is it's like not about the money, because you can't tell what money is. Money, it's like all money is the same. The thing about money is that it depends on what the strings are and who's attached to the money. And so the thing that feels really important is for people that are playing a fundraising role to have the conversation internally with all of their stakeholders, whether it's their members, their staff, their board, partner organizations, about what are the values that undergird your fundraising and your development work. So I have really close friends that fight for low-wage worker rights, and they're working in the South. And as you know, Amazon is taking a ton of, you know, there's a lot of money to be given away by Walmarts and Amazons of the world, the Targets of the world. And so they're going through a process to figure out like what makes sense in terms of using those resources. Same thing with Comcast and litigating around broadband access issues in communities of color and low-income communities. And so everyone falls across the spectrum a little bit differently. And so my only advice and my reflections are centered around having the conversations before with the people in your organization to figure out what your values are and how to make sure that your values are constantly aligned with your mission, as well as everything that you do in your organization, from HR all the way up and down to fundraising and development. But the thing that feels really important as a lawyer is to look at grant making, to look at the grant agreements, to really figure out like, what are the expectations? Can you take the money free and clear? Do you ever have to talk about it? Do you ever have to acknowledge it? Or do you have to celebrate it? And do you have to constantly refer to their money as well and essentially like clean it up? And so those are answers to questions that only you could answer, and your organization and your leadership teams. But having been through many rounds of having to do very challenging like that test your ethics and that really test your values, it's just really interesting when money comes into play. So that is my reflections and some advice as well.
No, that was great.
Can I add something? I would say the other, when it comes to strings attached, I mean, Voltaire basically said, if you want to know who owns you, think of who you're afraid to criticize, right? So that's one thing to always think about when there are strings attached to any pot of money. But you can also, make an ask of the donor, right? Because, there's so many ways that they can be engaged, especially if you want to build a long-term partnership. So it's not like, here's a check. Right. We've checked out our box of good deeds, right? And now you go and do something. But you can also make the ask, like, do you want them to have some kind of participation with your clients, or do you want their legal team to come do pro bono work? Or, is there some way you can build in that relationship so that they can see their work in action? And that can be sort of a cultural change that can happen within their own group, because then people are working and engaging with the work that you're doing, and they can go back and say, hey, I did this and this feels really good, or this has changed my view on things, or I thought X or I thought Y. So I think it works both ways.
No, I agree. I mean, because all too often when the money is flowing down to the organization or to the organization, there's this sense of gratitude or gratefulness that the organization benefits from that. And we almost don't feel empowered to then go back to where the money is coming from and say, hey, these are the things that I need from you as well, because the organization that's sending the money is getting benefit from that, and we should be able to dictate or have some control over that interaction, that interchange of to and fro. So that was good. Thank you both.
Yeah, I think the crux of authentic conversations is the trust, right?
Yep.
That you build, and you're putting yourself on the line sometimes. You're putting yourself always on the line of getting burned, right? That's always out there. But if you kind of come with the view of, okay, let's build a place for trust and engagement,
Together.
that's when that you laid sort of the foundation for that to move forward. And
No,
feedback and communication is super important too, right? Always having that check-in and engagement and setting those metrics with each other so that they're getting feedback, you're getting feedback on how this communication is going. It's sort of a loop that needs to happen to keep that authentic conversation flowing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. The trust between the organization receiving the money and the organization giving the money is important. Moving into the sort of next part of where I wanted to go with this thought is that there's also a trust that exists between the organization doing the work and the community that it's serving, right? It's hard to do good work without someone to work for or on the behalf of. And this is for both of you, your thoughts on maybe the obligation, maybe that's too strong of a word, but what are your thoughts on any level of communication that should happen between the organization and the community it serves as a result of taking money from XYZ corporation? Should there be any sort of discussion or an engagement with those constituency groups?
Archie, I think you should start with this because we had a conversation about this.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because it's every organization is a little bit different. If you're a membership-based organization, it is in your mission and vision to be able to support your members. And it's not just about program, it's also about the back end of the organization that I think it includes development and fundraising work as well. For me, I mean, as having spent 15 years in and out of philanthropy, social justice philanthropy, and then worked for the federal government, it's like everything that undergirds this work is capitalism, and against the backdrop of like wanting to hold corporations accountable and really wanting to hold unchecked, unfettered capitalism accountable. There's a real conversation that's happening in this country that is past time, past due, all of the above. And so for me, it's really about, it's like that transparent conversation that needs to happen. So a couple things. One is every organization has a 990 form that you fill out for tax purposes, and it includes your key funders as well as salaries as well. And that's all public on the internet, free and accessible to the masses, to the public. And so that information is already on the internet. And so it's a question of whether your organization really wants to, how transparent does your organization want to be about the resources? And it's so interesting because a lot of corporate philanthropy and a lot of social justice philanthropy, private philanthropy, family foundations, individual donors, because they were so wealthy, oftentimes the roots of those resources are oftentimes not clean. And that is up to the organization in terms of like being able to take the checks. And you've seen, there's lots of examples of organizations really grappling with the resources that come in. And there was a really famous story about the Gates Foundation doing research around doing, I believe it was like supporting malaria abatement in like West Africa. And that they found that like they went upstream literally and metaphorically to figure out like why there was an increase in malaria. And it turns out, because you may have seen the story, it's because one of the companies that was creating a component of a Microsoft computer was polluting the water that was causing the malaria downstream. It's like, it was just like one big awful corporate capitalist cycle on the backs of people of color and poor people. And so, you know, there was this big uproar to be like, you're taking this money to figure out learning, but like it's all connected. And so there is just like this, I think personally, it's really important to have that conversation with your members and be really transparent around it. Other organizations have not taken that, and then people get into trouble. You see it in particular around corporate philanthropy, and I'm thinking about Comcast, because that's a really recent example about the work that they've been doing around broadband and their deep interest with communities of color and the stickiness that's coming. And so it's like basically every organization, you know, has, I think, will have an opportunity to make, hopefully every organization will have the opportunity to make hard choices about money. We should all be so lucky to have resources that are flowing and have enough resources to say no. Because I just also want to acknowledge, like, I've come from really like, I've come from organizations that are very well resourced to be able to say, no, I won't take your money. But that's also very elite, that's very privileged, that's very coastal, and recognizing that resources from corporations and philanthropy are quite limited in, for example, like the US South or the Midwest or in indigenous communities across the country. So like I said, it really takes a matter of like figuring out what your values are, figuring out how your values intersect with your development work and across the organization, and then having a communication strategy about that work. There are no easy decisions. I have lots of opinions though.
And that's why we're here, to hear and to talk through your opinions. I've got 4 kids myself, and you know, throughout the history, they're all teenagers now. But you know, them growing up, I was always more upset with the cover up than the act, right? And so the crime, if you will, or the thing they did wrong, always bothered me a lot less than the lying about it and the trying to cover it up. And the like, look, kid, I was your age 20 years ago. How are you going to try to convince me that what you did isn't what you did? So I agree with your premise on being upfront and having those conversations with the constituency groups.
I think it's incredibly important because the other premise is you're not going to make everybody happy, right?
Yep.
You don't want to make people so upset either. There's this, you know, constant balance. I mean, you look at Netflix as an example. The CEO gave 150 billion to BLM groups across the board, and then it was like this big to-do. It was 150 billion. It wasn't even million. It was billion. It's a lot of money. And all of a sudden, the organization cracks started showing, right? Because then other, you know, Black actresses, Black actors came out and said, no, there's been racial discrimination in Netflix against us, and these are the things that are happening, which opened up conversations, which opened up changes. Maybe some of them aren't where they need to be yet, right? But that's kind of what ends up happening when there are movements for things like that. So engaging your constituency, I think, is super important to have these authentic conversations and keeping them in the loop, because nobody likes to find out about a decision after it's done, right? That's when the real pain happens, because then people don't feel valued, whether it's stakeholders, whether it's constituency, whether it's staff. You know, that's something that leadership should always think about at the nonprofit level, like how, you know, how do we like engage with the group in a productive way? But you're also knowing all the while that not everyone's going to be pleased with the decision. So I think that's when you go back to your mission, your values, your alignment, having clear directives on what's really important to you as a group and an organization.
No, that was great. Great, thank you. So what's the bridge too far? When do you say no as a leader, as a individual that has this mission that you're trying to push and you want to move forward and you need funding to do that? What's the bridge too far?
Active litigation. If you are suing the company that you're getting a lot of money from, that feels like a bridge that you may be burning. Yeah, so I don't know. That almost feels like, yeah, I would start there.
Okay.
I'm curious about Fairuz, if you have other lines. That's an easy one.
It goes down to the values and the mission of the organization. You always have to go back to the mission. You know, why were you formed? And there's also to be an awareness of the evolution of an organization too, right? And since the the killing of George Floyd, so much has happened within organizations that support BIPOC, principles and want to see sort of change in that area. So the things may have changed in your organizations in the past year, or maybe COVID influenced the change, or the horrible administration from the orange person I will not name could have made impacts and changes that have changed your organization. So there's so many factors that are going on. So if there has been a significant change, then once again you need to go back to your values as an organization. You need to go back to your mission as an organization and try to build as much alignment as possible. And then if it doesn't feel good, you walk away. There's always going to be somebody else. There's another pool of money. Just because it's this person who's coming to you, or this org or this corporation is coming to you and say, I want to donate to you. If you feel it just doesn't feel good, walk away. That's always the option.
I have a really practical lens. One of the things I care really deeply about is your communication strategy to be deeply integrated with everything in your organization. That includes your fundraising work. And so that is why it's really important to have comms and development really in lockstep. And so one strategic screen is, if you ended up on the front page of the New York Times because of this grant, how would you feel? So that's like another screening tool that feels also really important. Having worked for George Soros for many years and the Open Society Foundations, it's oftentimes the case that if you take Soros money, you sometimes end up in the newspaper. Sometimes it's mostly radical right newspapers, but whatever, it's still a newspaper. And so that is, in fact, it's a screen that one can use to determine whether it is a vision, mission, and values fit with your organization and the work that you're doing.
Does that communication pendulum also extend to the Montgomery Advertiser, or is it just the big outfits like the New York Times that you would consider in making those determinations? With the sort of small town, not that Montgomery's that small, but the small town papers as well, just to make sure we have that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, if you're doing work and your work is supporting the people of Montgomery, then I would think that you care deeply about what the local newspaper says about you. So it's just so funny because like sometimes you may not and sometimes you do, but yeah, like I said, like the problem with tainted money is that they're tainted enough. No, I'm just kidding. it's like I've had to say many times no to specific organizations. One of the stories that we had was I created a fund to support women of color in workplaces around sexual harassment in the Me Too era. So it was a $25 million funders collaborative, to support organizations to end violence against women and girls of color in particular. And what was so interesting is that at that time, there was a lot of corporations that were getting nailed for their sexual violence, sexual harassment of employees. And word had caught around that we were creating this fund, this collaborative fund, this grant-making vehicle to re-grant to organizations working to end violence against women. And a major corporation that had a multiple front page New York Times stories about sexual harassment in their leadership, offered to give us a significant amount of resources, like 7 figures. And so so we were engaged in a dance back and forth to figure out, like, what does that mean? What are the strings that are attached? How do they want us to talk about it? How they want us to announce it? What happens if we're going to sue you? Like, what happens if our grantees sue you? And they were like, this is free and clear, go for it. And I was like, really? And they're like, go for it. So we took the money. Absolutely. It's like, but we also had no qualms about where it came from and why it came. It was really clear why it came, because this was the dirty money that they were trying to clean and absolve themselves from. And we were happily to accept it because literally there was no strings. We never had to talk about it. We never had to acknowledge it. And for me, I was really grateful for the money because that money came from people inside the corporate, like the corporate media, the corporation that really wanted to do good work, that were as angry as we were, but they were the insiders that helped to move significant resources to the community and to women that were combating violence against women and girls. And so that is a story that some people are really surprised. They're like, we can't believe you took that money. And I was like, yes, we did, because they need to do better. And one of the reasons they're going to do better is by giving a lot of their money that they made to organizations like us. So that's an example, like a real life example that happened a couple of years ago. front page headlines. And basically what they were trying to do is like clean the money, and we gladly accepted it. And I'm really grateful that I really don't get to I don't get to celebrate them. Yeah, it's not about celebrating the company. It's basically being like, yeah, we deserve that money. The grantees and the advocates that are fighting to end violence against women and create a world in which all people can live with dignity and respect and free from violence is possible.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you both so much. Transitioning to the sort of workplace portion of our discussion, for those that you don't know, I'm a Black man, right? And particularly, I'm a Black man that grew up in Detroit in the late 80s and 90s. And so that is a part of who I am, good, bad, or indifferent. It comes with me everywhere I go. This idea of code switching, if you will, has been a part of my fabric since I began any sort of work over the course of the 30 plus years that I've been working. Recently there's this sort of idea of bringing your whole self to work. It's become a theme across organizations throughout our country. Fairuz, what does that statement mean to you? What does that term mean?
Well, it means a couple of different things, right? But it's basically showing up with all your ethnic self, your religious self, your political self, like all of who you are at work, and being in a process where you're engaging with people in that capacity, and they see you in that capacity, and you're bringing that up on the regular. It's just like who you are, it's how you show up. So that's what that definition really means.
Yeah. So what are some ways that maybe our organizations can help with diversity and inclusion initiatives? How can you bring sort of cultural diversity to the workplace?
Well, I think, it's damaging when you are spending a lot of time doing code switching, right? When you're not bringing your authentic self to work, it's really tough. And there's a lot of work environments where a lot of people sort of hide that side of themselves, right? And it's deteriorating to their self-esteem, their sense of self, their ability to feel like they're part of the workplace. So I think the first thing that everyone should really think about from a leadership level is making sure there's space for that, right? Creating space for having people show up, having people engage, and also checking in with people. Because the one thing you don't want to do to your, BIPOC colleagues is to actually expect them to carry the burden of being the ones who are always called upon when there's a DE&I issue, or when there's a statement going out about something or other, right? So you always want to engage them, but you want to give them the opportunity to not always be the ones to be called upon, because there's an emotional tax to that. So that's something that it's really important to know. The other thing I think is really helpful in any workplace is to have a blind survey where people can be asked questions that they may not necessarily, if they were asked, in a group situation or a one-on-one meeting with their supervisor, or even trusted colleagues, that they might be able to air, because so much of what we sort of hold about ourselves, our whole selves, when we're used to not being able to present some of that, is that we subconsciously hold that back. And the blind survey is a really nice way for people to kind of write out, like, what are the things that they are bothering them, not only in the workplace, but within the leadership, within the promotional team, within compensation. There's lots of questions that you can ask of people to kind of see where things are. The next thing is sort of revisiting the core values of your organization. You want to sort of explore terms and definitions as well in your organization. Like, what are the terms and definitions that you use on the regular? Like, that's incredibly important as well. Like, if you're committed to diversity, you're committed to D&I initiatives, like, what are the terms that you're using? What is the engagement? Another thing is, and there's one social justice glossary that YCA created, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in the chat, because I think this is it's so well done, and it's a really great example sort of having that group discussion in your organization about like what are the terms that we use, what is our definition of these things, what do they mean, how do we use them? So that's really important. The other thing is you got to understand your own biases. We all have bias, we just do. What is that bias? What is the unconscious bias, not only of yourself, but what's happening on your team? So having the key to authentic equity conversations is really understanding that. So Project Implicit, I'm sure many of you have heard of them. They have a really great survey you can take that you can test your own unconscious bias. So that's really great. And I created a guide that all of you are going to get, and there's a link to that in there. So that's a really great tool to check your own bias. But it's also great sometimes to bring in a DE&I person to do a presentation who's outside of your organization. Many of us, like within our organization, because we have maybe less resources, like we're gonna tap into our community to come and do our trainings. We're gonna tap into each other to do our trainings, but it's really nice to have somebody from the outside sort of come in and do some engagement and exercises to really get people moving in that area. And I also put some resources in for that as well. Also, I know this is like beating a dead horse, but diversity in leadership.
Yeah.
It's really important, right? Like if you don't see diversity at the higher level, it just doesn't trickle down. It doesn't feel, people don't, you know, it's just that engagement has to be there. Like people want to go work in a place where people look like them, or they see leaders that look like them so they can aspire to that, or sound like them, or have the same, you know, sexual orientation or whatever. Like that's really, really important. The other thing that I think is really key is once you have like your diversity statement, and once you really drill down to what your principles are for diversity, equity, and inclusion, incorporating them into your bylaws, because that creates the cultural change. It just becomes part of who the organization is. Now it's not just the mission of we serve X or we serve Y. Now it's like, okay, not only do we do that, but these are our value system. This is how we look at DE&I. And then you can also build in metrics for that as well into how you measure those goals, because measurable goals is really important. If you say, okay, we have a commitment to hire diverse leadership, and that's what we're going to do. Well, that's great, but that doesn't have any teeth in it, right? You want to put teeth in it. Like our goal is to diversify our leadership by 30% in 5 years, and this is how we're going to do it. We're going to recruit from this. We're going to like go, you know, this is going to be our pipeline program. Like whatever it is, you want to put the teeth into it. You want to have it reevaluated. So that's really important. So once you start doing those things, that's when people are comfortable showing up as their whole self. And that's when the contributions and engagements start, because that's incredibly important. Diverse people just completely change the game for everything. They have different perspectives, right? Of how you look at a problem, the problem solving, all the wonderful things that come from having a diverse team with diverse perspectives starts to come to fruition when people feel supported. So that's incredibly important. Also, it's important to know who the influential people are in your organization, like who controls the money. You want them on your side when you're like sitting down and talking about DE&I initiatives, because they're the ones who are gonna, you can go to and say, hey, I need money to bring this amazing trainer in, or hey, I need like some money to go and work with an outside organization to help build our value statement, or you know, whatever it is that you need. Like those are really important as well.
No, I think I was gonna, I'm sorry.
I said, I hope that answered the question.
No, it did. It actually answered I think the follow-up question I was gonna have as well.
You know, I want to also share this really amazing book that's coming up. It's called Choosing Courage, The Everyday Guide to Be Brave at Work. And I'm also going to pop that into the chat. It's coming out.
Who's the author? Choosing.
Oh, wait a minute. Did I not? I may have put the wrong article in. Oh, hold on. Let me just go ahead and, it hasn't come out yet. So just ignore that last thing I popped into the chat. I think I just, okay, this is it now. The author is Jim Dietert, and it's basically a really, I think it's going to be a great book. It hasn't come out yet, but you can pre-order it.
No, that's great. That's great. Okay, cool. I thought you were going to say something. Didn't want to interrupt. you've shared a couple of good sort of tidbits and takeaways that the group and myself that we can take away and sort of chew on. Anything else that you think would be helpful for us to take back to our respective workplaces as we try to move these efforts along?
Yeah, I put in some trainings and things that you can do within your organizations in the guide. One was reverse stereotype training, and I go into a description of what that is. There's like 4 or 5 things that are really helpful within an organization to kind of work on these issues and like incorporate this into your everyday culture. Because I think what happens is that sometimes DE&I issues come up when an incident happens, right? Or it's an annual training that you have to do, mostly on the computer by clicking through things. Right?
Check the box. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And some of them are so ludicrous that you're just like, this is crazy. I would never do that. Or who does this? Or I've never experienced it. Like some of it doesn't feel real. But putting in some of these more interactive trainings where you actually work with the material and you sit down as a group and you collaborate is a really great way to sort of bring some of these things in. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into it in detail, but it's definitely in the guide.
But no, and that's fair. And we'll take that guide and we'll look at it. If we don't have any questions in the chat, then maybe we can dive into it a little bit. Limby, were there any questions from the group?
I don't have any questions in the questions box, so if you dive in a little bit more, we'll wait a couple minutes to see if we get any more questions.
No, that's great. Guys, if you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box. So one of my follow-up questions to some of the things that we were talking about, the last part of the conversation, it may be rightly so, felt like a top-down approach. You know, these are things that we should start with at the top, that we should implement so that it sort of filters through the culture of our organization. Do you have any advice or any thoughts on what we can do at the ground level? So maybe from a bottom-up standpoint, the individual employee, the new hire, the individual that may be 2 or 3 years into the organization, how we can start to create the change within that culture. I think one of the things that you mentioned was knowing who, where the purse strings are, and that was something that I took away. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that it's really interesting, like having done being in the career services world for 10 years, seeing students leave as students and coming back as professionals and seeing that evolution. And one of the things that I've spoken to a lot of our alumni on when they've hit some of these barriers is when you enter a new organization, you want to find who your partners are within that organization. You really want to get a sense of like who is in this organization that is someone I can have these authentic conversations about, who will sort of be able to give me an insight of sort of what's happening, because you need to know the lay of the land, right? And you want to find your allies within the organization. So that's really important, because if you see things that just don't feel right and you want things to change, I think sometimes being the lone voice is harder than being the voice that comes in a community.
Right.
The other thing is reaching out to people outside of your organization that you know of that are kind of doing what you want to do or what you want to implement within the organization, and finding out like how they did it, because that's really important, especially when you're a new professional. You know, the first few jobs that you have, sometimes you think, well, this is how every workplace is, and that's not always the case, right? I mean, every workplace has its own culture, has its own pluses and minuses. So part of it is really going out and seeking out information on how other people are doing things, and then kind of bringing that in. And once again, it is also having those courageous conversations, right? Having those, bringing up things that don't feel good, and starting a dialogue with them, and talking to people who are in a position of power as well. So once again, whether it's your leadership, whether it's the board, like whoever it is within the organization, just keeping that dialogue going, because I think that's the best way to start when you're, entering something new or a new place.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's such a tough, I know I suffer from imposter syndrome, and every month I wake up with the idea, I've been a professional now for 20 plus years, but this is the month where they recognize that, I'm not as good as someone may think that I am. And so those courageous conversations are difficult. You know, you start to build a life and a family, and you have all of these responsibilities, and you just want to make it through, right? You just want to get to the next thing. So I appreciate that.
Well,
feedback.
I really want to say you just brought something up about imposter syndrome, and I actually taught a workshop on that, actually 2 workshops on that in the last 2 weeks. And I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is that there's a really great article, it was in Harvard Business Review, that said, "Stop telling women they have imposter syndrome." And the crux of that article is basically that, you know, people don't just, you know, workplaces are designed to create imposter syndrome for people of color. They are, and it's really fascinating. The article goes into detail. I'll find it for you guys in a second and put it in the chat. And one of the things that are really important to know is check that about ourselves. Like, is this what's happening with us? Are we like second guessing ourselves? Do we feel like we don't deserve a seat at the table, right? Like, we want to answer those questions for ourselves, and then we want to poke a hole in that and go, what is the evidence to back it up? Because I guarantee you, if you ask for evidence to back up these thoughts that you're having, you're not going to find any.
You sound like my wife now, but it's, you know, it's tough to overcome, you know, a number of years of building on that. But you're right, I know that. So.
Can I just add around to that piece of it? It's my favorite quote by Mrs. Obama. She talks about how she's been, it's like, I've been at every powerful table you can think of, and they're not that smart.
Yeah.
That is literally my favorite quote. I take it with me everywhere I go, including when I was at the White House, when I have worked for, you know, these, whatever, the some of the wealthiest people in the world. And so I really keep that with me because it makes me laugh. And it's also very true. So I really appreciate that quote for anyone that's looking for a quote as they're navigating their professional lives.
It is definitely a good one, and often a true one. That's the toughest part. Has fundraising sort of changed in the light of not only the you know, everything that we're dealing with social unrest and change on that end, but just from a pandemic standpoint and everything we're dealing with you know, industry not moving along as it has for decades prior.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what undergirds fundraising is relationships. It's like what undergirds the world. And so I do think it's becoming really difficult to like build relationships, strengthen them, refine them, start from scratch. So I do think that the pandemic is really, in some ways, certain people have really been successful because there is so much money that has been made by a handful of elite, you know, business leaders. And I feel like for folks that it's hard. It's like everything's a hustle. And the pandemic just exacerbated. It's like if you were already good, chances are you're going to be okay. And if you are already struggling, chances are it's going to exacerbate the struggle. And it's the same for everything from like parents to fundraisers. So it just really crosses the board, which is why I'm very excited that the vaccine is available and hopefully everyone will be getting a vaccine.
Yeah. Second dose scheduled for Tuesday. I can't wait.
Awesome. Congratulations. Thank you.
These kids and looking at them every day. So
Awesome.
This is a joke. This is a joke. Did we get any questions in the chat?
No, I don't have anything in the chat.
We just aren't that engaging, guys. I mean, is that what I'm left to believe?
You are the most engaging, Eric.
You answered all of the questions before they could even, as they were forming in their minds, you all just knocked them all out of the park.
Obviously.
Well, you know, I did want to take an opportunity to thank you both for taking time out of your day to have this conversation with us. Any closing thoughts or closing words that you'd like to share with the group?
I think, you know, just be yourself, bring your authentic self forward in all your conversations. I think it's incredibly important for happiness, longevity in your career. I think, you know, in all the years that counseled and coached people, the most unhappy lawyers are the ones who are just always compromising themselves in some way. So always find that path. There is a path. There is a path. There is another opportunity. Keep talking to people. Keep networking. I think the networking piece, we tell students that ad nauseum in law school, and they just look at us like, what are you talking about? Your network is everything. Your network is going to be your opportunity for your next job. Your network is going to be your opportunity for your next fundraising opportunity, your next promotion. You never know what's going to lead you. So keep meeting people, keep talking to people. You know, keep an open mind.
Your network is your net worth, is what an old mentor used to tell me all the time. So that good advice.
Cosign. I love it. Also, my daughter is here eating Oreos, so I wish she could participate in the Oreo eating.
Leela.
Any last or closing thoughts other than the cosign?
Yeah, I would say other than Oreos are delicious. Let's see, closing thoughts. I would just say that, yeah, it's like it's like the reflections and the hustle is real around like being a person of color, and especially as a woman of color in the workplace. And just like always, it's like time to go back to purpose. It really is about going back to purpose. And I feel like in politics in particular, or when you're dealing with like large national movements, some people get confused between power and purpose. Lisa, can you keep it down for 1 minute? And if you can always go back to your purpose and the values that undergird your purpose, you're gonna be just fine. So that's what I tell myself every single day, at least.
No, I think that's good advice. I'll start adding it to my bulletin board as well. Well, I appreciate you both for your time. I'm sure you added value to a number of folks out there. You certainly added value to my interactions. So if there are no additional questions or concerns, I think I'll give you back 2 minutes of your day.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank
Thank you so much, Eric. Thanks, Equal Justice Works. Thank you.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Did you eat it?
Yeah.
No, we got